Be alert, be awake. Do not be weighed down by dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. Please be seated. Six or 7 years ago, Malcolm Gladwell wrote in a book called Blink, The Power of Thinking Without Thinking. He wrote a story of how police officers are trained to walk into difficult situations in moments where seconds mattered and seconds slowed down, because what happened in those split-second moments, the actions that could diffuse or escalate, would change the lives of everyone involved. And now, 5 or 6 years later, I think we might also want to raise additional questions of human error and bias, and those are important. But today, I want to talk about what Gladwell wrote about how time changes when you stop to pay such close attention. His point was that in those intense moments, in an encounter that might take just a few seconds or maybe even less, time slows down. And anyone who has been in a situation of great danger may know a little bit of what I'm talking about. Time slows as the officer becomes intensely aware of every piece of information that they can possibly take in that brief moment. And that within that matter of seconds, there is so much to see. They see and hear far more than most of us do in a typical moment in our lives. And their attention is highly attuned because every life in the room could depend on that. So thinking about that moment, thinking about that state of heightened awareness that could mean the difference between life and death, let me ask you a fairly pointed question. Is that a metaphor for how most of us live our lives, awake and aware of everything popping around us? I'm going to go ahead and say no. Probably not. More often than not, most of us, me included, live on the other end of that spectrum of awareness. And today, this first Sunday of Advent, we are reflecting on the promise that God makes to us. The promise to be with us, to be among us, to be a part of our everyday experience. But I would suggest that in terms of our general awareness of all things sacred and meaningful, what we're really doing most of the time is sleepwalking. Sleepwalking. The Gospel of Luke gives us then a strong word of warning and even alarm, to be alert, to be awake, and to know that we are being lulled to sleep in our everyday lives. Jesus says, be alert at all times. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down by dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life. Because these things stand in the way of our relationship with God. These are the things that stand in the way of our very awareness of God's presence all around us. These things that Jesus names, dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, these things consume our attention and often buffer us from the very words of comfort and challenge that would lead us to transform the world, that would lead us to know that God is there in the midst of us, even in the hardest moments. But if we're distracted, if we're self-medicated, if we're worried, if we're focusing on everything but the heart of the matter, we can't hear others and we can't hear God. And believe it or not, we can't even hear our own authentic voices speaking out from the most intimate places of our hearts. So we can even categorize these three words. I'm going to keep coming back to them: dissipation, drunkenness, and worry. We could even characterize these as sins. But I don't want you to think in terms of that definition of sin that I know that a lot of us grew up with, right? Sin is that's those bad things that we're not supposed to do, but we do anyway. Rather, I want us to think of that as things, those choices that lead us to turn our lives away from God. Choices that seem benign, but actually anesthetize the very part of us that is holy, the tenderest parts that connect us to God. Now, if we want to think historically, church folks throughout the ages have been very good about creating lists. Let's talk about sin for just a minute. Has anybody heard of the 7 deadly sins? Right? Anybody who went to Catholic school knows about the 7 deadly sins. I want to first of all offer some respect to whichever theologian or clergy person created a list. This was like a blog long before blogs existed, to say there are 7 sins, these are the ones you need to stay away from. So I want to credit the creation of that list, but I also want to take a minute to think about, can you remember what those 7 deadly sins were? Right? Shout them out if you remember them. What's your favorite sin? Sloth, good. What else have we got? Pride, gluttony. Oh, happy Thanksgiving, everybody, right? So I had to remind myself what some of those were: lust, envy, greed, gluttony, sloth, wrath, and pride. I know that when we hear that, that does sound a little bit like old school grumpy church. But think for just a moment, and this is not a sermon about the 7 deadly sins, so don't worry, but do think about those things, right? Gluttony, wrath, sloth, all goes on. Things that keep us from seeing the image of God in ourselves and in one another. And that if we have a heightened vocabulary of that, it's not about guilt and shame. It's about uncovering the goodness that is within each of us and it is within each person around us. The point of that is to help us have a little bit of a lexicon for getting at what stands in the way of us and God. Jesus tells us, stay awake. Be alert and on guard. Do not be weighed down with the things that put you to sleep. And here's where I'm getting to the heart of the matter. I want to improve on the 7 deadly sins, and I want to introduce my own list for us to carry through this season of Advent and whenever we need it. I want to take what Jesus names today, and I want to call it the 3 sleepy sins. The 3 sleepy sins. Be on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and the worries of this life, and that day catch you unexpectedly like a trap. Stay awake. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about those 3 sleepy sins. And I'm going to start where Jesus does, and I'm going to name that first one that Jesus names, which is dissipation. Okay, I'm going to take a guess that not many of you woke up this morning and said, I really need to work on dissipation. I need to get control of that because that's a real problem for me. Anybody, you're welcome to raise your hand if that's your first concern. But it's curious. It must mean something because Jesus names it, and Jesus names it right out of the gate. Well, literally, dissipation means to disperse, to disintegrate. I think that in a spiritual sense, that means that something vital and God-given is going to waste. We are given so many gifts in our lives, and perhaps because of misuse or inattention or not being in good spiritual practice, whatever that means for each of us, we lose pieces of what we have been given. And when we do, we lose sight of God. And dissipation, by the way, is a scientific word. It's a term from physics. Dissipation is a process by which energy is used or lost without accomplishing useful work. Dissipation is a process by which energy is used or lost without accomplishing useful work. That's right, Jesus is my physicist. This is a warning against spiritual drift, against entropy, where our focus piddles away, where we lose sight of who we are and whose we are. So then Jesus moves on. And when Jesus then mentions drunkenness, we can think that he moved from being asleep to being passed out, or rather talking about that. They're not the same thing. And I don't believe he's just talking about wine. Jesus is telling his followers that whether it's gluttony or hedonism or drink or anger or sex, any number of these things lead us to a place of inwardness, and often a place where our focus is on anesthetizing ourselves rather than living the life that God created for us. Those things that overstimulate us can destroy us and will certainly dull our awareness of God. Addictive behavior, in whatever form it takes, it can make us feel so much more alive and vital in the moment. Or maybe it makes us feel numb at a moment when the pain is just too much to take. And we think that that's what we need. But in many ways, that's just sleepwalking by another name. Where do we struggle? Where does our pain lead us to harm ourselves? Power makes us drunk. Fear makes us drunk. Our desire to project ourselves out into the world, to make it to conform to us, or perhaps even so that we can protect ourselves from those harder edges, all of those things can become addictive. And I believe that the most painful conflicts we often have with one another often have some degree of this, some degree of addictive behavior to them. We get hooked on something. We get hooked on our need to be right. Or our pain is so great that we don't know how to keep from passing it along to someone else. Or we don't know how to let it get so deep down that it tears us apart from the inside. And I want to stop for just a moment to remind us all that when Jesus tells us this, Jesus is not speaking to us from a place of judgment or shame. Jesus is not saying, just say no and get sober. Jesus is speaking to us out of a place of love and compassion. Jesus knows the real you and wants that soul to emerge, to be healthy, to be loved. He wants you to know and to treasure the soul that he knows intimately. So, do not be weighed down with dissipation. Spiritual frittering is not spiritual growth. Do not be weighed down with drunkenness. The kingdom of God is not to be found with a quick fix. And then, of course, and to me this is where it really gets hard, do not be weighed down with the worries of this life. Do not be weighed down with the worries of this life. If you're like me, you're like, Jesus, are you kidding me? Are you serious? I mean, there's stuff out there to worry about, right? Did he have any idea when he said this, what we would be dealing with today? And of course, the answer is yes. Yes, he did. There have been versions of this all throughout history, and there will be versions of this all again. And the point is, Jesus knows where we suffer, and Jesus knows where we worry. And I'll tell you this, I can't tell you not to worry. And I can't tell you that among the many things that I'm sure many of you are worried about, that there aren't 3 or 4 of them that do need a little bit of attention. But I can say this. Jesus says very clearly that worry will put us to sleep. That's because worry masquerades as focused attention, when in fact it's the exact opposite. Right? Worry actually separates us from an awareness of God's presence in those moments, in those places where we need God the most. And isn't that the promise that that's exactly where God is going to be? I always love what Richard Rohr says. When we move into that worry mode, we're watching a movie in our minds, and what he says is 96% of those are reruns, right? There's almost no original content, which I think is perfect. It's just perfect. These are all of these things I'm talking about, they tell us that we're more awake and that we're more alive, but what they're really doing is putting us right to sleep. They're the big lullaby. They are the 3 sleepy sins of dissipation, drunkenness, and worry, and they are particularly dangerous because they help us think that we're more awake, but we're actually sleepwalking. And so Jesus says to us to wake up, be alert, for life is happening right now and you may well be missing it. Be awake because the kingdom of God is unfolding all around you, and the moment is coming when the hungry will be fed and the poor will be uplifted. But the ones lost in distraction or gluttony or worry or wrath or pride may just miss it. Each of us, each in our own way, knows a little of what it means to be lulled to sleep, to become blind to the great signs of change, from the roaring of the sea to the sprouts of the fig tree, to become desensitized to that still small voice of God within us. And so, we must wake up. Our invitation in this very sacred season of Advent, at whatever stage of the journey, at whatever point of transformation you may be on, our opportunity is to wake up, to listen, and to become more and more aware of the promise that God has made to us. This is God's promise to be with us, to be among us, to heal us, and to make us whole.